you get that sort of second hand or around the coffee pot or something, and maybe it's the best way to get it. But at least attention should be given to this. And so we decided to try and put together some sort of a lecture series addressed to the problem of teaching for those of us who are concerned with teaching, because it will be a good part of our lives. Last year we got going a bit late. Dean Magoon and myself looked around and didn't really have much luck in finding speakers available by the middle of last fall. They're all booked up. We did bring Harold Taylor out here, and those of you who heard him speak last year were fortunate to hear a very stimulating, very provocative man with a great number of ideas about what he calls the current malaise of the American university and its failure to commit itself at all really to teaching. And yet it is indeed one of its most important functions. This year we got down to work a bit earlier because we continued to think this was a very important topic. And Dean Curtis, whom you'll meet in a moment, and myself, and Dean Magoon, Dean Atkinson, Chuck Wilmot, who is now president of the Graduate Student Association, and several other members of the association conferred, worked out a list of people we would like to hear, and then began to send out the invitations. And as you see now, we have quite a number of people to talk about the various aspects of teaching, the way it looks from various important quarters. Our first speaker here then in the series will be Dean J. Peterson Elder of Harvard University, where he is the Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. Dean Elder was formerly a professor of classics. Maybe he still is. Are you? Yes. You still are teaching classics too, so he has his finger in the teaching pie. And Dean Elder is concerned, as many are concerned, with the amount of attention and consideration being given to teaching in the university of the 1960s. For a lot of reasons, which I think he will make known to you this afternoon, Dean Elder feels that we ought to stress this a bit more. How he sees the stress or where it should be placed, I don't know. Again, I'm anxious to find out. There seems to be, and I think it's very hopeful, a good amount of unrest among younger faculty and graduate students about this. And I hope it will lead to a rededication of all of us who will make the university our lives to this one very important part of our university lives, good teaching. So to introduce our principal speaker, I want to invite Dean Mark Curtis, Associate Dean of the Graduate Division and Professor of History here, who has worked very hard with me, in fact much harder than I have, frankly, on putting this thing together, to come up and introduce to you our main speaker. Dr. Curtis. One final administrative detail. Tonight, the discussion, for those of you who will come back for this at 7:30, will be held in the Women's Lounge rather than in 2408. Ordinarily, we will hold it in 2408 Student Union, but now it will be in the Women's Lounge tonight.
Thank you, Pete. I don't need to list for you at this point Dean Elder's qualifications. I think he will present them to you very adequately in the address he will give. And I cannot introduce Dean Elder as someone whom I have known for a long period of time. I went to the wrong graduate school. I have known him, however, for many years by reputation, through the commendations that persons I admire and respect have made. But long acquaintance is not necessary for recognition of his qualifications and high abilities. What I'm trying to say is that Dean Elder is like a good vintage wine. One needs only a small taste to appreciate what he is being offered and as a unique and exciting experience in meeting him. His clear mind, pungent expression soon make one realize that he is dealing with a rare person, perhaps someone who has learned in his study of the classics something of the virtues that Horace, one of his favorite subjects, used in his own writing. When I first asked Peter Elder to lead off this series of lectures on college and university teaching, he disarmingly responded, "Are you sure I am the man you want?" I'm happy to say that I could as quickly respond that I was very sure that he was the man I wanted. I had heard him perform on a panel discussion about a year ago in which he had spoken to the topic, which agency should train college teachers, the graduate school or the institution of first employment. He had made on that occasion good sense and brought freshness and light to a session that was bogged down with platitudes. Just before I approached him with my invitation, he had participated in another panel discussion that I was attending. His remarks on that occasion confirmed my decision to invite him to speak to us. On this latter occasion, he was addressing himself to the question, what can the undergraduate college do for the graduate school? He and his colleagues on this panel had again spoken good sense. I am delighted that Dean Elder accepted our invitation so willingly and generously. In particular, I am delighted that you will have a chance to savor his wit and wisdom this afternoon as he speaks to us on the importance of good teaching to higher education.
You better wait, you hear something. I'd like to say that I'm very glad to be here, and not least of all selfishly, for when I left Boston this morning, there was such a howling blizzard that would have been congenial to King Lear. And a cheerful announcement over the radio that 4 to 6 more inches of snow are expected tonight. I'm also, is this too loud or? I don't like them. I'd rather, you can hear me without me. Is there anybody fortunate enough not to be able to hear me? If I should apologize, and I don't know that I should, for reading what I am going to say to you, I can do so by reminding you that the Emperor Augustus never addressed his wife Livia without notes. For fear of saying too little or too much. I don't want to press the parallel. I have no Augustan aspirations, and I'm certainly not so rude as to compare you to that sanguinary empress. So I shall begin. The perplexities which beset the American college today, whether it be a college by itself or a college within a large university, as here, the perplexities are, I think, heavier than they've ever been in our somewhat kaleidoscopic history. In saying this, I am not, I believe, being just a wryly smug child of my own times, for I have in mind 2 present-day factors, too familiar to you, which I think make our situation rather unique. First, the truly shattering explosion of knowledge, which somehow, and I know that I speak to sympathetic ears, somehow the teacher and the investigator must try to keep up with. And second, the equally astonishing increase in the sheer numbers who want and will go to college and will go to, though it is hard for anyone beyond God and his prophets to foresee what the form and the quality of the colleges will be like. And now I ask you, what are the chief perplexities facing the liberal arts college? Suppose you and I, a fantasy which we shall soon want ended, suppose you and I were a college or university president or a chancellor. After all, cats, or at least deans, can look at a king. What are the toughest problems you and I, as chancellor or king or dean or president for a day, would be facing? For my part, I should set these down, and then I should at once nibble a bit of mushroom and rejoice in my real size. First of all, how to raise the money. Alumni and legislators, I fancy, can be equally uncooperative. How to raise the money for the teachers and for the plant, though some presidents would reverse that order. How much federal and foundation aid can we manage with a straight face to get? Or how much should we be able to take and still remain academically pure? And I remind you that even pure snow drifts. Sometimes I should say that these two first perplexities blur themselves one into the other. Then, another question, is an inferior education for all the youth of the land nationally more desirable than a good education for the able youth? If the answer, God willing, be no, how many of these able youth can we admit without losing the baby? Don't misunderstand me on this score. And another one, how shall we preserve, add to, and adapt a liberal curriculum in the arts and sciences to modern conditions? Under modern conditions, I'm thinking, for example, of such area studies as those concerned with the Middle East, Russia, the Far East. I am not, under modern conditions, thinking of courses in automobile driving, or fond as I am of nymphs in woodland dancing. Finally, where and how to get good teachers, whatever exactly they may be. Well, these are problems enough for the nonce, so we'll live with those. Of all these problems, two seem to me head over heels above the rest in importance. How to keep and adapt a liberal arts curriculum, and how to get good teachers for the arts and sciences in this curriculum. It's about these two that I shall speak this afternoon. And I should tell you, and I hope you'll understand why I do this, that I shall combine theory, as I dream of it, with practice, as I have seen it, good and bad, at Harvard. Before starting in, I should give you some warnings. First, about my background, where I come from. I might almost be tempted to answer that after that rather jiggly plane ride out of Boston today. And the Lord said unto Satan, From whence comest thou? And Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. Instead, which is a letdown, I shall simply say I come from Williams College and Harvard University. The latter has within it Harvard College for undergraduates. It's a parochial background, two private New England institutions, but these are all that I know well, and I must speak of and from what I know, particularly to the point of the curriculum and to the quality of teaching. The first, Williams College, in my time, which was 1930 through 34, was poor in its curriculum. Sociology and psychology, for example, being, as everyone knows, dangerous subjects, were forbidden. A fifth year of Latin was required of every freshman, and everything was wrapped up decently in the purple beauty of the Berkshires by making us all go to chapel 8 times a week. So much for the curriculum. The faculty, look back now as charitably as I may, the faculty was even poorer. But you will see from the third speaker on this program that things have changed radically. As I say, the faculty was even poorer than the curriculum, which I suppose is an argument for conservatism. I had only two professors, one in German and one in ancient history, who moved me. And you and I know what we mean by that word. The rest were dull, they were lazy. Even I, as a raw and respectful freshman from an upper New York State rural high school, felt they were lazy, and they were simply not quickening. So much for my undergraduate period. But one can learn by observing what was missing. Harvard, where I went for graduate work, was at least different, shockingly so, with all kinds of pulls and tensions and new things and excitement and increasing requests of my father for money. But I view Harvard differently today. Not only do I not pay Harvard, Harvard pays me. But by now I'm used to its hectic ways, and frankly, I like them. Today I view it from a more objective point of view, from the position of someone deeply concerned about its educational policies. Now, I hope you understand that I have to talk about this background because I am talking out of experience, and this I must lay before you. Now, as for the administration of Harvard, of which I am a part. In this respect, Harvard reminds me of France before the Revolution. Aged, creaking machinery of government, fiercely jealous of the rights of the aristocracy, which some assume to be the faculty. A part of her mulishly conservative, and yet another part daringly and brightly liberal, and withal a great and uniting love of the arts. A world in which faculty and students can say what they feel. Both groups constantly sharpen this prerogative lest it grow dull or blunt. A world which is so individualistic that if it has any overarching educational policy at all, it is to have none. To decide each matter ad hoc, to patch up, to improvise, but never to be so foolish as to generalize across the board. A protean world which innately distrusts conformity and which is hard even for a dean to get a hold of, which is probably a healthy situation, with all respect for those on the front row. So much for my first warning to you. Now I have two more. If I shall seem dogmatic, do not believe that in my heart I possess such sovereign assurance. This attitude is partly professional front, and therefore habit, and partly assumed to elicit debate and comment from you later on. Then, if I talk a good deal about Harvard myself, it is not just because of egotism. I am egotistic, of course, as my friends here will tell you. And it is not for nothing that I myself contentedly and often recite these verses. The clever men at Oxford know all there is to be knowed, but not one half of them knows one half as much as intelligent Mr. Toad. Indeed, I remind myself, and shamelessly without any embarrassment at all, I remind myself of the rather Yankee Lacedaemonian Epher, who you recall at the Congress just before the Peloponnesian War, having listened to a great long speech from the Athenians, this rather Yankee Epher rose and said, "The long speech of the Athenians I do not pretend to understand. They said a good deal in praise of themselves, but nowhere else," etc. So I say without embarrassment, for if I'm to talk about what I know something about, then I must refer to Harvard and to myself in Harvard. The liberal arts college is, by all odds, the most valuable single institution in American higher education. We can and we should criticize it. Nowhere is it perfect or even nearly perfect, but we must do all that we can to help it, the notion and the concept of it, to preserve its best features, to modify it and adapt it to today's society's needs. This is a sweeping statement. I make it unhesitatingly for two reasons. This, the Liberal Arts College, is the best institution which we have for gradually and ultimately training people to know when to think and when to decide, and then to decide and, by heaven, take a stand by themselves. Further, in today's complicated society, we need liberated specialists. By that, I don't mean technicians. And apparently, the best way to produce liberated specialists is through our graduate schools of arts and sciences. And apparently, the best way to prepare men and women for graduate school is through liberal arts colleges. Let me at once add two caveats. I am distinctly not saying that the liberal arts college should become a training station, a sort of waiting room for the graduate school. Neither am I saying that the PhD programs are hallowed and perfect. They need, heaven knows, a lot of reform. But the PhD degree remains the best degree that we have. And by and large, we must work within that degree and work to make it better, not just contemn it. To go back, why do I praise so highly the Liberal Arts College, where I, as you, sir, hope that most of you will end up? In my reply, I'm bound to seem to you platitudinous. This is because, I suppose, truisms are iterations. And at least I want you to know that I have miraculously arrived at these seemingly trite conclusions through my own free contemplations. The Liberal Arts College, whatever be the precise combination of courses in the arts and in the sciences which a student may take, it ultimately aims at liberating a student, at freeing him, at liberating him from the, may I say, from the metallic confines of this mid-20th century, from its cold chrome. It frees him, or it helps free him, so that he too can reasonably and responsibly judge and choose for himself in his post-collegiate years, whether he then be a businessman or a public official or a professor or a lawyer or a doctor or 100 other things. The process by which the college does this is, I agree, fuzzy. It's hard to get your hands on. It's rather full of incense and holy water. Howsoever that may be, it is the 4 years in such a college, and I don't know why 4 years were picked and sanctioned. It's these 4 years that seem to be the best, the most hopeful instrument to hand for teaching a man, if he can be taught at all, to begin to discriminate, to begin to acquire taste. If he is to be equipped to discriminate in his mature years, he will have to have been trained imaginatively to ask himself whether a situation is an important situation, and if it is, should he act in it? And if he should act in it, should he act in this fashion or that fashion? And what will be the results, and whom will they affect? And then he'd better turn the whole question around, look at it again from another point of view. This is a tall order. But it's an order that is surely desperately wanted in that hardest of all forms of government to run, a democracy. Indeed, if I may digress for a moment, and it is pure digression, I should say that if we have one moral plight today, it is not at all the matter of our morals, as these are commonly understood in quotation marks. It's a matter of a sort of national weakness in our reluctance quickly and willingly to make an independent decision and to stick by it. Well, be that as it may. At all events, a liberal education then differs radically, does it not, from a technical education? For the latter teaches a man beautifully how to perform a set technique, but not how to think out his future course freely on his own. And the liberal education I have in mind, I might add, differs too from the sort, I'm being slightly vague here, from the sort misleadingly purveyed today by some so-called liberal institutions. Not to accuse the living by name, I shall revert to Jane Austen and say that I do not have in mind the sort of thing she refers to when she speaks of a seminary or an establishment or anything, this is all quotation, or anything which professed in long sentences of refined nonsense to combine liberal acquirements with elegant morality upon new principles and new systems, and where young ladies for enormous pay might be screwed out of health and into vanity, unquote. And you will recall that Jane Austen was a chaste maiden. No. The kind I have in mind calls not only for knowledge. We should not fool ourselves. We should get nowhere without sound knowledge and a good deal of depth. But the kind I call for also demands a freewheeling, lawless, disrespectful, critical ability. In short, if I may resurrect that venerable word, it calls for at least an approach to wisdom, which is different from knowledge. And yet, to seem paradoxical, this very liberal, liberating education, in the end, only frees a man so that ultimately he becomes willingly obedient to an ethic, to a moral code that is based on the premise that conformity is a suspect thing. This code, which perhaps will be only dimly apperceived, a student with his teacher's help and his teacher's help in and out of a classroom will have forged or have begun to forge for himself, hopefully in his 4 years at college. Now, the job and the product are never ideal, but they are the best that we can show in a world which is not overly populated by demigods. And you and I must earnestly try to make the job and its product better. All right, that brings me straight to the matter of the importance of good teaching. I am not going to debate in scholastic style why good teaching is a good thing. We, all of us, have had poor teachers, and we know that we could say, if we wanted and were churlish, something harder about them than that they merely bored us and cheated us of our tuition. The harder thing, the obverse of the coin, is that they didn't quicken and fire us. And I assume that the results of mental and spiritual quickening are, fortunately, often transferable. I simply remind you of the answer, you recall, which Louis Armstrong gave to the woman who asked him what jazz was, and he looked at her and said, "Lady, if you gotta ask, you'll never know." Rather, I'd like to raise two matters with you. First, publish or perish versus good teaching in regard to promotions. And second, what ought or could graduate schools do about helping graduate students learn to teach better? Let me parenthetically add, for the sake of any, I doubt there are, for the sake of any college presidents who may foolishly have wandered in here, that, as Dean Curtis said, they too have an obligation. But to refer to that debate, if you try to argue with college presidents, what they tell you is a bit of some portion of a commencement address that was put away. At any rate, they're very exasperating, but that's how you become president, I'm sure. At any rate, it is up to people like Mr. Magoon, Mr. Curtis, myself, to remind them that the prime business of a graduate school is to train a man in depth. It is for this reason, I should perhaps add, that I do not favor a sort of general education PhD, which some foundations have seemed to wish to promote under the charitable folly of cultural breadth. Make no mistake about it. The more complex a society and culture, the more specialization will it demand and need. Only, I dare say, in the Neanderthal culture was there any room for a general education PhD. If critics charge that training in depth is in itself a narrow affair, and it is, I can only hopefully reply that the able and gifted student generally pushes through the bothersome present methodological limits, and you have my sympathy, toward future speculative horizons. Now, as to this matter of publish or perish versus good teaching in regard to promotion, I want to be as careful and clear and honest as I can be. And I've given you my background so that you will inevitably take what I say cum grano salis. Sed non multis cum grani salis. First of all, there seems to me a good deal of truth to the proposition, publish or perish, though it is stated in too extreme and too exclusive a way. The publish seems to stress the quantitative at the expense of the qualitative, as though we were to put competing instructors' works on the scales and weigh them. Or not just weigh them, but weigh to see whether the footnotes do indeed weigh more than the text, and so on. The perish, gloomy word, has an aphoristic finality about it, which simply is not true. The or suggests that all other possible fates are excluded, and then you become a boojum, I suppose. But I firmly believe two things on this score. First, that the good teacher goes on discovering, ordering, and evaluating truth. And let me at once say that truth, and this is not really very important, truth for the natural scientist having to do with the now, the last second, is quite different from what truth is to the social scientist and the humanist. This is quite unimportant. My point is that the good teacher goes on discovering, arranging, and evaluating what he thinks is truth. Second, I believe that the best way a man can arrange and criticize his own discoveries, his own findings, his own conclusions, is for him to discipline himself to set them down on paper. I speak absolutely out of my own experience. I have found myself on page 9 saying something I had thought to be right, which was in violent disagreement with something on page 2. And if I had not honestly had to set this thing down, I just jolly well could have gone on believing they were both right, and I surely would have conveyed that to a class. So I say to you, I think the man who writes something, sets it down, must be the clearer and the more competent teacher in the classroom for having gone through that process. And Let me take the bull by both its horns. Furthermore, his paper should be published so that he may realize in his work that his peers too will criticize it just as he himself had criticized it. Obviously, his main reason for publishing is to help his peers and the whole world of scholarship. Now, let me qualify. Not, I believe, by pussyfooting. I ought to add, well, I'll do it right now. Not by pussyfooting, but by stating what seem to me the facts in academia. Quality does really count over quantity. But you can get into trouble here. It is true that 2.5 ounces of the real stuff is a lot better than 5 pounds of dunghill trash. But the perfectionist may labor so long over getting the 2.5 ounces that he may come close to perishing. I know no answer to this, except that we are not Methuselah, and you should not sit around forever, which isn't much comfort. Well, I say quality does really count, and may I now be personal for a moment. Last week, my own department, to give you an instance, declined to promote an instructor, this is the classics department back at Harvard, declined to promote an instructor now in his second year, an instructor who, mirabile dictu, had published at least 4 long articles. And we declined to promote him on the grounds that what he had said wasn't really terribly important anyway, and it was awfully windy and verbose. We didn't find it perceptive, and it was on the whole a bore, and it seemed to all of us they were getting longer rather than shorter, and this was a bad sign for the future. So I believe he'll go somewhere else. Further, I want to make another qualification, for I do know the liberal arts college, whether it be a Williams or something of that size, or Pomona or whatnot. Further, no administration can expect a teacher in an isolated, small liberal arts college, which will probably have a fairly heavy teaching load. No administration can reasonably expect that person to put out what the parallel teachers, say, in the college here would. It isn't important. It is not important that they put out a great deal. It's very important, however, that they keep trying to find out things for themselves, and as they have the time, do it. I said I think I'm not pussyfooting. It does sound compromising. I'm saying there's some kind of middle line in here. So let me repeat. The teacher, I believe, is surely the better in the classroom for investigating for himself and for having subjected himself to the impartial ordeal of setting his findings and conclusions down on paper and publicly. The concept of a Mr. Chips, who never did any original work at all for himself and never set pen to paper, is a romantic delusion, or at least a lovable rarity. In short, what I'm really saying is that for those of you, I'm addressing the graduate students here, that those of you who are not unreasonably timid, who are not going unconsciously to invent 101 excuses for doing everything except your central job, your whole academic life ahead of you is going to be rent by conflicting pulls and pressures. These won't kill you, but they're going to be there. Those of you who right now are teaching assistants or teaching fellows, you already know what this situation is. And you're going to live with it all the rest of the time. I live with it. For you, on the one side stands your research and the writing of your thesis. On the other, your paid duties in the university. And already, too, I'm sure you've discerned a third side. The informal, quasi-official, unpaid chores which you are invited to take on. This pattern will continue, and actually it's rather zestful. At times, the tangle of conflicting claims will bewilder you, but then, thank heaven, they'll irritate you, which is always a good conclusion to bewilderment. And you will then firmly decide to do this and decline that, and work your way through somehow. And, you know, sometimes, at least when you're far away on holiday looking dreamily back in a kind of hedonistic myopia, you'll even say to yourself that tensions make for a rich and interesting existence. And, you know, that's true, they do. The main thing is that throughout it all, you will watch over your teaching and you will watch over your research and publication in some kind of heaven-sent uneasy balance, however much your family may suffer. Even I, as a dean, teach each year and sneakily do some writing. In fact, if I weren't here right now, I should almost surely have hurried through in as cold and cavalier fashion as I could through the graduate school office fuss and been home working on a faulty first draft of a perfectly splendid article I'm writing on the 51st poem of Catullus. Actually, I brought the draft, however, by airplane, and Professor Levine will have to look at it, so that I've even taken along with me, you see, so that you will work in these various items, and they really don't conflict. Now, at this point, I say a word, however, about the combination of teaching and research in the natural sciences. For here I believe that the flow of federal funds for research has without any doubt posed a danger for the importance to be given good teaching, or teaching at all. Perhaps we could say that I'm not myself at home in this area. Perhaps we could say either that the easy flow of money has actually increased the respect paid research at the expense of teaching, or that at best, research in the natural sciences is an equivocal friend to teaching and often an outright enemy. But this is a question, not a statement. Apropos of this, I'd read yesterday a little article in the paper that the president of Massachusetts Institute of Technology has just put out his annual report. Headlines are, he appeals for unity of teaching and research program. And he complains about I'll quote this article a little bit. As a result of its accelerating development, President Stratton said MIT faces serious problems. These include the growth of research as compared to teaching, and the increasing demands made on MIT faculty members for research, and so on. This is really serious. In the past year, Stratton said expenditures for research surpassed expenditures for teaching for the first time since '54. And then he concluded, the commitment to teach is by no means necessarily in conflict with a commitment to research. And he has certain proposals. I know this man and know him to be an honorable man, and so I think he, not only I know he means what he says, but probably will do something about it. If I look at what goes on in the natural sciences at Harvard, now I'm not always sure that they let me see all I should. They're tricky. I find the picture, I think, not so distressing as it's usually depicted. For one thing, I myself am not at all disturbed by differences in formal teaching loads. I think to look at those as a kind of bookkeeper's mentality. The scientists do not chiefly instruct their graduate students in courses, but they do so in laboratories. And they work long and hard at that, and I know it. As for undergraduate instruction, full professors with us in the natural sciences do pull their load, and they're wise to do that too. And they do it manfully. And for another thing, let's see what you think. Another thing, we at Harvard have stubbornly refused to permit what is nowadays and hereabouts often the practice, the rank of research professor. If we did permit this rank, we think that in no time at all we should have 3 research professors to every teaching professor. And the result would be 2 faculties, and you and I know which faculty would be the second-class citizens. Instead, to protect our concept of the teaching professorship, we have used for highly skilled technicians, and I do not mean to do them an injustice. If I do, it probably comes out of bigotry rather than ignorance. We have used for highly skilled technicians the title of research associate. We're very chary anyway about giving them tenure. If we do give them tenure, we've invented a phrase, industrial tenure, which may be terminated with a year's notice on either side, and these research associates may not apply themselves for federal funds for any research project, but must do it under one of our professors. I don't know how long we'll hold to it. I think we will, as we've just hammered it out about 2 months ago. I repeat, our aim, and I'm sure we're determined to keep to this, our aim is to protect the rank of the professor. And in our concept of the professor, teaching plays a major role. By now I'm sure it's quite clear to you that I myself have no use whatsoever for the notion of 2 kinds of PhDs, one in teaching and one in research. And I can only think what a perfectly horrible kind of faculty it would be with this sort of dichotomy. But I'm equally sure that we have by no means heard the last of this wicked proposal. Now, if I may use what I observe at Harvard as a specimen for study and not for emulation, I'd like, as fairly as I may, to consider how much weight in promotion to the various ranks we at Harvard actually give to publication and how much to teaching. And you will understand that I may be off by a considerable number of degrees on this, but I should do the best I can and will certainly try to be every bit as full and honest as I can. I'll begin with the administration, where honor, duty, and title commands my beginning. The administration itself, which of course is subject, and rightly so, to a strong-minded and tough faculty, the administration cares very much about teaching. I know this, and I'll document it later. But since we also believe in freedom of speech, before I illustrate the attitude of the administration, I'd like to quote you a bit from an editorial in last week's Crimson, reviewing President Pusey's review of a decade at Harvard. This was more than his annual report. It was a report of his 10 years as president. I can give you only little bits of this, though I have the rest of it in that envelope. Quote, "There is little to guarantee that even a conscientious student will become educated during 4 years at Harvard. In fact, despite endless university propaganda to the contrary, it often seems that the university has only a casual interest in educating undergraduates. Although educated men do receive degrees every commencement, they probably would have learned what they did at Harvard in any college. Harvard did not necessarily make them. Harvard's self-assurance is therefore maddening. President Pusey's recent report on the past decade of the university is a revealing document. Page after page sings of the great growth of the university. Everything has increased in numbers. Endowment is up, enrollment is up, faculty hiring and salaries are up, course offerings are up, tuition is up, and buildings are going up. These achievements are impressive and desirable, but they are not good in themselves. Harvard's physical growth has not been matched by similar advances in undergraduate education. The undergraduate too often is easily lost in his new buildings and ignored by his prestigious and highly paid professors. I go on still from this fair editorial. The mere assembling of professors, students, and buildings does not produce educated men. But in recent years, the college has shown a tendency to rely on spontaneous interaction and to drift along on old formulas, making only those repairs which are absolutely necessary. The college's prime concern in its own judgment is the liberal education of undergraduates, but it fails to stand behind its rhetoric. I'll stop here, as I'm not sure it would be safe to go on giving any more. So I've ceased quoting. And I'd like to say to you that the editors of the Crimson, some of whom I like very much, remind me, again to revert to that Congress before the Peloponnesian War's outbreak, remind me of what the Corinthians said of the Athenians. So that I'm really complimenting the undergraduates, as is the wont of us. To describe, this is the Athenians, to describe their character in a word, one might truly say that the Athenians were born into the world to take no rest themselves and to give none to others. Yet, I know that the administration really does care about teaching. President Pusey, for let us, as the ancients did, begin with Zeus, Ekdios, Archomisthos. Mr. Pusey took his doctorate at Harvard in Greek history and literature, and he taught humanities at Wesleyan and was president of Lawrence College, which is a small college in the region of Wisconsin. He knows and remembers above all else what is needed for good education. As has been pointed out to him, his deans teach, and they're not ordered to do so. In the past half-decade, tutorial instruction, which is non-credit mostly for undergraduates, has been radically increased. Freshman seminars have been introduced, an optional ungraded course for freshmen wherein 6 or 8 of them meet once a week with a professor to follow him in an elementary way in his own research. And we have about 1/4 of the freshman class now taking these, which is certainly an awful problem of how to use a professor's time and so on. In the matter of promotions, the quality of a man's teaching is taken into account, and I think it weighs heavily. In the case of junior promotions, instructor with us has to have a PhD, and he may be an instructor for 3 years. Assistant professor may remain for only 5 years. Great many of these come out of the ranks of our own teaching fellows, which is the word we use for teaching assistants, whatever you. And we know them, and we know their past teaching ability with undergraduates, and we look at their scholarly potential. As for the permanent appointments, the associate and full professorship, and the first rank, I personally think we ought to get rid of. Does nothing but cause, these are the permanent appointments, and the associate professor is made needlessly unhappy by having that peculiar adjective attached to his rank, and he's going to be made a professor anyway. It's just kind of meanness and penny pinching to use it. For permanent appointments, the president of the university himself, this is a remarkable thing. Mr. Pusey himself appoints and presides for every permanent appointment in the university, in the 11 different faculties. The president himself appoints an ad hoc committee consisting of 3 or 4 experts in that field from outside. Thus, I know that one man who sat on the committee that had to do with my own case came from Berkeley. And it's worthwhile for the university to bring people there for that purpose, since you have an awful commitment and investment in a lifetime of a professor. Indeed, I once even tried to negotiate a professor we ought never to have appointed to give up for $40,000 and move somewhere else, but he wouldn't do it. At any rate, for every permanent appointment, the president has this ad hoc committee of maybe 3 or 4 from outside, and 2 or 3 from the university, but never in the man's field, in the field at stake, say if it be in Armenian, not in Armenian. The only people from the department involved who are allowed to attend are the chairman, who's cross-examined as if he were a convicted culprit. I've been one. And any member of the department who opposes the department's recommendation. This, therefore, throws all the weight on the negative side. Now, I've sat on a number of these committees, and I can report to you, for what it's worth, that in every case, questions have been raised about the teaching ability of the man involved, as well as his publications. And it's more often Mr. Pusey himself who keeps nagging away at this question of teaching than anyone else, and it's he who makes the final decision. This committee is merely recommendatory. In short, despite the crimson, I think we do want both. We want a man who has scholarship, who is not afraid to publish, will publish, but we're interested in the quality, not the quantity predominantly, and we also want a man to teach. Don't misunderstand me. We've made the most dreadful errors on both sides. We have some men who I suppose are scholars who are very difficult as teachers, and we've had some who are not much good as scholars, and let me add that they're generally not much good either as teachers, which is the other side of the coin of the thing. You can get it the other way around. Now, I'm getting near the end, you'll be glad to know. I was going down the ranks. As for the 750 or so teaching fellows, those are graduate students, those are my special charge. Again, I can say that we do try hard to help them in this business of teaching, but we haven't any single answer or method. Ours is, I confess, pretty much a little of this and a bit of that. We care, but we don't know what to do. Now, this is what we do. Senior professors in charge of a lecture course hold weekly discussions with our teaching fellows. But you never rise above the professor. Some of these weekly discussions are jolly good. Some fall absolutely flat. And what can one do? We give a series of non-credit talks on various aspects of teaching. I personally furnish funds for socially bringing together senior faculty and teaching fellows. Even the most rarefied nuclear physicist has to eat, and he might as well eat with teaching fellows. Therefore, I'm really wonderfully bountiful and tolerant. I'll furnish money for anything from coffee to bourbon. I don't do it for equal amounts of each. And I might add that the only department that's put in year after year for bourbon is the classical department. And as you would gather, they always get it. At any rate, we do that. Now, some departments, I think really only of three, have an awfully good institution, a course for first-year graduate students in the problems of teaching the subject. With us, the German department has one, and the Romance department has just begun one, and economics is doing a kind of informal tutorial. Nobody could or should order a department to do such a thing, but if God sends you a man in a department who is both a scholar and cares about helping graduate students, then you'll do everything you can to help him. But he's got to be sent from heaven. You just do not make them with all the fiats that could come out. And there's another thing some departments do, which I think is probably the best of all these things. I hope you understand I'm not an expert. We need here good psychologists to help us. Some departments sponsor, for say 4 or 5 teaching fellows, non-directed discussion groups. The 4 or 5 sit around with tapes and films of classroom and tutorial meetings. Now, this is awfully hard on the teaching fellows. It really is a tough ordeal to go through, but I think it probably produces better results. The one thing I'm perfectly sure myself you don't want to do is to infringe upon the independence of the novice graduate student teaching fellow. Therefore, you don't want to dictate to him various things. I think a non-directive group where he can learn by observation. I also have another feeling. That is that if there are what serious blocks and flaws occur in a graduate student's teaching, say in his first couple of years. I think this is a very serious matter. I have a suspicion that a lot of those remain on for the rest of his life. I think it's hard to get rid of those that come, but I'm not again in my own area. Well, our hit and miss approach is not owing to our lack, as I say, of interest, but to our lack of knowledge of a good technique. And maybe we can talk about this later on. In a nutshell, we do not want, or I do not want, a method which would threaten the graduate student's autonomy as a novice teacher. We do not want to tell a graduate student how to teach. We want to lead him up to the threshold of the classroom and then leave him alone. We do not want to produce a regimented set of teachers, as perhaps a school of education indirectly aims at. Rather, we want a way, heaven knows what it is, by which we may help the novice teacher to formulate his reactions to what he thinks is actually happening and should be happening in his own classroom. A way by which we can assist him to let his own personal style flower. It is not that we wish to impose a style on everyone. We want somehow to say, bring out from you your style and from you your style, and they'll be maybe miles different, and that's unimportant. Well, we should go on trying and groping. For the present, it's clear to me that our belief in the value of some experience in teaching for graduate students is stronger than our trust in any one method of helping him in this art. Well, at least we have at Harvard slowly arrived at the conclusion that a man who knows his subject well is not necessarily a good teacher. And that, if there be any truth in the dictum that a good teacher is born and not made, well, that's unimportant. There are too few of those divine creatures around to pay any heed to them. I close now. You have been patient, and it is time for you to say to me what, at a critical point in Pride and Prejudice, and that title has no reference to you and me, what at a critical point Mr. Bennet said to Mrs. Bennet. Mrs. Bennet, you recall, was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. Upon a major disagreement between them, this is what you may now say to me, what Mr. Bennet said to Mrs. Bennet. Mr. Bennet terminated the meeting by remarking, "My dear, I have two small favors to request. First, that you will allow me the free use of my understanding on the present occasion, and secondly, of my room." Thank you.
Sit around here for a minute or two and throw out some questions now in the immediate aftermath. Do so and see how many we get. And then, of course, we will have this evening in the Women's Lounge of the Student Union an opportunity to sit around more informally with Dean Elder and talk about this. So, do we have some questions now? I think Dean Elder can handle it. What?
Maybe they want to go eat.
Well, there might be one or two here at 10 after 5 who won't make it back. That's the point that I want to...
May I ask a question?
Yes.
Could you say something about how you determine the quality of the teaching in these groups?
At what rank, sir?
When you were speaking of these groups that...
Teaching fellows.
No, that Dr. Pusey headed in determining whether or not there was to be a promotion.
Ah, yes.
And I was wondering what the measures were.
This is the potential flaw in what I think otherwise is a pretty good system. If you wanted to load, actually what happens is that the dean generally asks the chairman of the department to nominate possible people. Thus, when I was chairman of my department,
people I nominated was one who was indeed a rather weak man at Yale, but a friend of mine. And the dean reminded me that unhappily for me, this was Mr. Pusey's own competence, this field of classics, and I'd better get a stronger man. So that if the chairman tries to send up a poorer man, the dean will know and send it down again. I think it works pretty well, but there is the one. I must say they're fascinating, not to go on beyond, because if you have three, let's say, from universities, either one is trying to plug for his own pupil or somebody else, or two of them just loathe one another, or all three loathe somebody else, and it's just amazing what you learn about the state of, say, medieval art in the United States. Well,